Hi, I'm Jim from the Fotobug, and today in this video I'm going to discuss the camera shutter and how it affects exposure. Well, what is a shutter? A camera shutter is essentially a door that opens and closes to allow light to reach the camera sensor. When a photographer presses the shutter button, it triggers a mechanical system as seen in this slow motion video. In DSLR cameras, a mirror flips up and out of the way, and then the shutter opens and closes. In mirrorless cameras, there is no mirror, only a shutter. The mirror in digital single lens reflex cameras is used to direct the light to allow the photographer to see through the viewfinder. Mirrorless cameras use electronic LCD video screens, and so they've eliminated the mirror. The shutter opening and closing is measured as a unit of time. Most higher-end cameras can be set for shutter speeds as low as 30 seconds and as fast as perhaps 1/8,000th of a second, or maybe even faster. If you need shutter speeds longer than 30 seconds, there's a special setting called bulb that allows the photographer to keep the shutter open as long as desired. However, you don't just want to set the camera shutter to any arbitrary value. If the shutter's too slow, you'll likely get camera blur, as you can't hold the camera still enough to keep it from moving during the exposure, even if the camera is mounted to a tripod. If the shutter's too slow, the subjects that you're photographing are likely to be blurred. There is a general rule of thumb to keep in mind to prevent camera blur when hand holding the camera. Essentially, take the focal length of the lens you're using and turn it into a fraction to determine the slowest recommended shutter speed. For example, if you're using a 100mm lens, don't use a shutter speed slower than 1/100th of a second. That's 1/100mm, 1 over the 100mm. And you can do this with any lens. Keep in mind that this is just a general rule. Many higher-end lenses have image stabilization mechanics, and some cameras, such as Sony, put image stabilizers in the camera body. Image stabilizers smooth out camera movement and will help prevent camera blur at lower shutter speeds. In the 100mm example above, you might even be able to prevent camera blur as low as 1/25th of a second. Another consideration for the shutter speed is the amount of motion blur of the subject that you're photographing. For example, I was recently photographing a crop duster airplane. If my camera shutter speed was too high in the final image, the props of the plane appear to be stopped, as if the plane was just simply gliding. This is obviously not what I intended. I needed to use a shutter speed that slowed motion blur of the props. I found that I needed to use a shutter speed around 1/200th of a second to 1/300th of a second to get the desirable amount of blur of the props. This brings us to the semi-automatic modes. There's shutter priority and aperture priority. This is one of the few times I would actually set the camera mode to shutter priority. Shutter priority is a semi-automatic setting that requires the photographer to choose the shutter speed and the ISO, and the camera will automatically choose the aperture. The proper shutter speed may also be important when using a camera flash, which will be covered in another video. To set the shutter priority, set the mode dial to S, or on Canon to TV, which actually stands for time value. To summarize, keep the following points in mind. The shutter opens and closes to emit light to the camera sensor, and so it's measured as a time value. Most cameras can control the shutter speed from as long as 30 seconds to faster speeds, perhaps as high as 1/8000th of a second. The shutter can be held open for longer times by setting the camera to bulb mode. The speed of the shutter determines the amount of motion blur of the subject, and if too slow, may cause camera blur in the final image. A rule of thumb is to use a shutter speed of no less than 1 over the focal length of the lens. 100mm lens, 1/100th of a second or faster. Shutter priority allows the photographer to choose the shutter speed and the ISO. The camera will set the aperture. If you don't understand any of these summary points, please go back and review the video until you do understand them. Thank you for watching. If you have comments or questions, be sure to leave them below this video, and please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any future videos.